souls, it's been a hot minute since I filmed something, about 3 weeks. Anything you saw was pre-recorded, so I'm trying to get back on the horse. And I'm doing it with this wonderful book by Carol S. Pearson called Persephone Rising, Awakening the Heroine Within. So this is a very, very powerful book. It deals with archetypes mostly, and it is very focused on how you can bring the stories of the archetypes, mythological stories of ancient Greek archetypes to be precise, into your everyday life in order to live a more fulfilled and a more balanced life. And the author does this in a very approachable, very practical way. And you can already tell that I'm going to recommend this book, but I still want to go into my positives, my negatives about this book, because there is something that sort of bothers me about it that I definitely want to talk about and let you guys know about in case that affects your buying decision if you want this book. So to start off, I'm just going to talk about Carol S. Pearson for a minute. She is a very, very famous depth psychologist who also consults with universities, with companies, with institutions in order to transform their leadership approach with archetypes. So you can tell she is very rooted in an archetypal approach and also a psychological approach, and that definitely shows in the quality of the book and in the academic writing style that she has. But I will get to that later as well. I hope the sun isn't too bothersome because it's kind of shining on my face. Anyways, so the first thing I want to say is that I absolutely love the cover art of this, the picture that is shown here. I'm going to put who did it and what it is in the description box or something because I can never remember the name of it. So let me first talk about how the book starts and how it frames everything it does. So the start of the book is a very in-depth description and analysis of the Eleusinian mysteries and how they happened in ancient Greece. The thing is that they kind of sound like a modern day retreat, except they were accessible to everyone, whether you were a slave, a king, a man, or a woman. No matter how divisive that society was back then, everybody could take part in the Eleusinian mysteries. That is what is told about them and what we know about them. And in this self-transformative experience that everybody went through, which was full of psychodrama, full of typical retreat stuff, but also some role play and really, crazy stuff that brought you into a better mindset and helped you embody the different archetypes of goddesses and gods. I don't remember how I started the sentence. Anyways, that is what the Eleusinian mysteries are about, and it is quite interesting. She starts the book with this because it kind of frames what this book is supposed to do for the reader. Because she goes through 4 archetypes essentially, Demeter, Zeus, Persephone, and Dionysus, in order to educate us about the narrative, but also to help us take that narrative back to self and grow through those stories and learn from those stories, just like the people did who went through the Eleusinian mysteries a long, long time ago. Now, let me say something about her approach real quick, because I feel like that is a very important thing. I have a few notes on this, just a few key words. So her approach is definitely woman-focused. I wouldn't say she comes across as exclusive. She doesn't come across as a TERF, certainly not. But it is very focused on women and on the struggles that especially modern women go through. It is a very academic book. You can tell that she has worked in a university environment for a long, long time. Her writing style is sublime. Her approach is also kind of literary. I myself went to university and studied literary studies, and I can definitely see a lot of that in her approach, and it is very familiar to me because it is a very analytical and interpretative approach to text. Then she also takes a narrative perspective. She talks a lot about narrative intelligence and about how narratives can help you identify limiting beliefs. They can help you grow as a person. And through going onto an analytical level and looking at the narrative levels and stages that the protagonists of the stories go through, she gets a lot of juice out of these stories and a lot of value out of them. Essentially, her approach is one of reworking your life with the help of archetypes and with the help of these stories. It's also about finding your authentic self, finding your purpose, finding what you are legitimately drawn to, what you can bring to this world. So essentially, it is about the transformative power. Her approach is very transformative, mythically, psychologically, based on wisdom, based on philosophy. She brings all of that together, but I will get to that in a second. So essentially, if I had to sum up the 4 main aspects of this, it would be connectedness and community, which is the Demeter archetype. Then you have self-empowerment, which is the Zeus archetype. And then you have following and carving your own path, which is Persephone. And then you have living with joy, living outside of deadening routines, which is what Dionysus is about. So with these 4 archetypes, we basically have a very good basis, a very good baseline of narratives to help us live a life that is balanced and that is fulfilled and content. And that is the basis of all of this. And of course, she has a lot of nods to famous philosophers, famous psychologists, such as Joseph Campbell, C.G. Jung. She talks about him. And, you know, it's definitely an approach that is rooted in a lot of secondary literature, a lot of knowledge on her part of different modes of thinking and different thinkers in the area, everything surrounding psychology and archetypes, because obviously she's a depth psychologist, so she knows a lot and brings all of it into this book. Now, that was her approach. Let us talk about my negatives and my positives. So the positive, I would definitely say that there is so much academic legitimacy in her approach. It is this amalgamation of very ancient knowledge and ancient narratives, but then modern narratives, pop cultural narratives, movies, but also modern philosophy, modern psychology. And she brings all of that together and interweaves it into something that is very, very powerful and at the same time very pertinent to the self, very pertinent to the single reader who is trying to work with this. It's not an academic text that just focuses on analyzing, you know, the philosophy of these ancient Greek texts. No, it is very much more about something usable that you can draw out of it and bring into your own life. And I very much appreciate that she manages to bring together the academic approach and the personal approach at the same time. And you can tell that she has a lot of talent and a lot of experience in bringing these stories back to self. And throughout the Demeter chapters, you definitely notice how much that specific archetype has helped her. Because let me tell you what the Demeter archetype is about, just so you have an idea of what each archetypal chapter kind of encompasses. She basically talks about the positive sides of it, the negative sides of it, the shadow aspects, but also some similar narratives that we can draw more wisdom from. So for Demeter, for example, you have as the positive aspects the selfless love and also self-care of a mother. You have the connection to the earth, which Demeter is very big about. She basically controls the seasons. She controls how people are nourished. She also stresses the caring community, the aspect of being in a community where everybody supports each other, knowing that you are cared for if you really need it, you know, protection of weaker individuals, the sickly, the elderly, the children. All of that is kind of in the realm of Demeter. But then she also talks about the shadowy aspects of any mother archetype. And I think if you know anything about archetypes, you know that the shadow side of the mother is the martyr. That is the most meaningful shadow side personally to me as well. Because, you know, not only can a mother get a little bit devouring in her care and sapping someone's strength with their dependency on her, but she can also become kind of a martyr who doesn't tell you how much they do for you, but then fault you for it and guilt you for how much they have done for you, even though it's kind of their task to remember, hey, I got to take care of myself. I'm giving too much of myself. And switching into this martyr mode is one of the biggest deals with mothers, definitely. And I think anyone who has a mother has probably been guilted for how much she has done for you before, I guarantee it. Another shadow side is putting conditions on love, expectations, critiquing the other person, and also obviously overgiving and then guilting the other person, as I said before. So it is a very circulatory, round picture that Carol S. Pearson draws here of every archetype. She is able to bring together the best and the worst of every archetype and really take it into an everyday context and say how it affects us in our career, in our family lives, in our life in general, in our everyday life. So very, very powerful there. Oh, and another shadow is, of course, manipulation by withdrawing love and withdrawing care, and thus making the other person do certain things that you want them to do. And in Demeter's example, that is when Zeus doesn't want to give her Persephone back, essentially, or get Persephone back for her, Demeter takes away the grain. She takes away anything that grows, anything that nourishes the people, and the people are starving. Zeus's people are starving. And by doing this, she manipulates him into giving her back her daughter, because all of her pleading, all of her appeals to him didn't make him give him back her daughter. So she had to resort to that tactic. And I think that is quite interesting. And there's a lot of deep looks at stories in this book like this. Now, I said before, she has a very academic writing style. And if you know anything about me, you know that I very much appreciate that. I've said it in past videos where I reviewed books, and I will say it again. Her approach, her academic writing style, it just gives so much legitimacy to this book. It is structured very well, it has no loose ends, and what I love especially about it is that throughout the 5 chapters, it's not just additive. She doesn't just add knowledge with each archetype, but it's also integrative, which means that, if she talks about Zeus after Demeter, she relates the two back to each other. And when she gets to the end, to Dionysus, she relates him back to everything before, so that you have a very rounded, well-rounded picture that teaches you way more than if she just had them as these compartmentalized single units, that you kind of go through. It's a much more complex and interconnected approach and picture that she draws, and I very much appreciate that. Another thing I want to stress is that she brings in these very deeply personal stories. She talks about how the archetypes specifically benefited her personally in her life, and I think it is quite beautiful how vulnerable she is in that moment and how open she is with what happened to her and how those archetypes helped her move through it. Because, sharing your own hardships and showing that archetypes can help you in the process of overcoming them is very powerful to read about, because then maybe my hardships that each reader has can be mended or helped or supported with these archetypes. And that is the truth of the whole book. And the fact that she was not just limited by an academic approach where you don't want to bring any personal stories in, no anecdotes, no vulnerability. She wasn't limited by that. Instead, she brought in that vulnerability that gives much more meaning to the book and to the story that she tells. And why do we not take people seriously who share personal stories? In the academic realm, in the university realm, you don't get taken seriously if you tell too many anecdotes or are too vulnerable about what happened to you, even though at least in Germany. I have to say it's probably different in the USA, but in the country that I live in, it's not really something that you bring into the mix because it makes you seem unserious or unreliable. You know, the whole bag of bullshit that comes with vulnerability being something that undermines your credibility. And that is very sad, but I think it's great that she brought it into this book and was able to share those stories of hers. Now let us get to the stuff that I did not quite like, where she didn't fulfill my expectations, where it was a little bit negative. I still want to stress that I highly recommend this book, but I do think that you should adjust your expectations in some ways, and I want to go into specifically what I mean by that. The first thing I want to say is that sometimes there is a little bit too much secondary material and too little talk about the actual stories. She does go very deep with the story about Zeus, because that is probably one of the most detailed stories, because you know, he's a male god. So of course he got a lot more attention in the storytelling of the time and of everything that has survived till now than the goddesses. So I understand that she probably has a harder time finding stories about Demeter, Persephone, etc., or more detailed stories at least. There's so much more detail in Zeus's whole path of life. Like, he is the most important guy, and that is why there's a lot to analyze, as opposed to Demeter or Persephone, where there's not as much detail usually. So I understand that she does need that secondary material, but sometimes her interpretations went a little bit too long. For example, she talks for a very long time about some detective novel series, about The King's Speech, that movie, about Interstellar, about the Abandoned book series, and I think it is great to bring ancient psychology, ancient narratives back to a modern level and relate it to modern narratives. But sometimes her interpretations were a little bit too lengthy. And even though they did have legitimate results in the end, I feel like the focus was sometimes a little bit too much on those stories. And especially, I have to say, for Persephone. Because I had one expectation of this book named Persephone Rising, you know. And that was that it has a focus on Persephone. Well, it's a little bit difficult. First of all, you have to get through about 170 pages before you even get to the Persephone part, which is fine. You need to prepare, you know, you need to be ready mentally for the greatness that is Persephone. But at the same time, the Persephone part is a little bit weak. And the reason for this is probably because the story of Persephone is so nebulous and so unclear. But I think she could have dedicated a bit more time to that story. She does talk about the different versions of the stories that there are. You know, there's a version where she literally gets abducted against her will. Then there's a story that she was actually in love with Hades and wanted him to abduct her. Then there's a story where she gets abducted, but then she's okay with it. You know, there's a lot of variations on this, and depending on which context and which approach you come from, whether it's psychology, you're trying to treat a patient who has had a bad experience and you want to help them with the Persephone archetype, you know, depending on all of that, you might change up the story and tell a different telling of it. And I think it's very important to see that there is some difficulty in trying to figure out how to approach this story. And I don't want to diminish that difficulty, but at the same time, even though there is no canon, I feel like she could have spent a little more time on those stories. But instead, and I can appreciate that, she finds a lot of Persephone-esque characters. For example, the whole story with Psyche and Amor, and also the Abandoned trilogy. She links that very closely to the Persephone myth and draws wisdom from it. But I can't shake the feeling that Persephone kind of vanished a little bit in all of those interpretations. And, you know, being the dark goddess that she is, being kind of nebulous, not having a strong canon around her, that is kind of her character, that she steps to the background and vanishes a little bit. But something was missing, and I can't quite place it. Maybe if you've read the book as well, you can let me know whether you felt the same way. I definitely did learn things about Persephone. I did gain perspectives about Persephone that I didn't have before, so I don't want to diminish that. But I do want to say that for the book to be called Persephone Rising, I was expecting a bigger focus on her archetype. And of course, I know that usually the people who write the book, the author doesn't have much influence on the title, so I'm not saying she made a wrong decision or anything. This is probably just because Persephone is rising so much in popularity, and it was the best thing they could do to market this book. And I can appreciate that, because the more people read this book, the better, because it is a phenomenal book. So I didn't know a lot about Dionysus before this book. I had my preconceived notions, but I think that was one of the most interesting approaches she took, because he is so much about getting rid of deadening routines. He is the person who calls the people to the Eleusinian mysteries, and he is the one who kind of breaks open the routines of everyday life and questions what structures we are stuck in, societally as well as on a personal level. And that is also why I have created an Etsy reading that has helped me personally as well, that revolves around kind of honing in on these deadening routines. And I will put a link to it down below in my Etsy shop, because I do read tarot. I do try to help people with the wisdom of tarot and my insights about it. And this reading is something that is very close to my heart, because routines are such a killer for my creativity, for my productivity, for my feeling of connectedness. So I really wanted to put that out there, and you can check it out with the link below. I will also put a link to my Patreon, to my Instagram, where I post quite regularly about some deeper insights I have and get a little bit more personal. And I'm also going to link my book reviews playlist below. Feel free to take a look at that. I reviewed books by Harmony Nice, Thorne Mooney, Lisa Lister. So have fun with that, enjoy, and I wish you the greatest of days, the greatest of weeks, and I will see you very, very soon.